a black silk collar pressed against a wooden lattice. A man's knees hit the kneeler hard enough to crack the silence. His breath came out shaking. He hadn't shaken in 40 years. Not once. Not when bullets passed his ear on a dock in 1987. Not when a federal van followed him for 6 blocks in 1996. Not when his own brother turned up dead in the trunk of a sedan he had ordered the keys for. But here, alone in a dim church at 11 at night, with rain ticking the stained glass, he was shaking. A small lamp behind the curtain glowed orange through the carved olive wood. A voice on the other side murmured a single line of Latin. Soft. Patient. He pressed his forehead to the wood and started to talk. What he said in the next 20 minutes would erase his family by sunrise. Stay with me on this one. His name was Salvatore Marchetti. The crews called him Don Salvatore. The cops called him Sally Two Coats because he always wore one over the other in cold months, no matter who was watching. He was 58 years old. He stood 6 feet flat. His hair was iron gray, combed back tight. There were 3 faded tattoos creeping above his collarbone, lines and crosses, and one name in cursive that nobody had asked him about in 20 years. He wore a black wool overcoat over a black silk shirt. The shirt was unbuttoned at the throat tonight. Tonight he wanted the priest to see the lines on his skin. Tonight he wanted to be looked at as a man and not as a title. 6 weeks. That was the number a quiet doctor in Manhattan had given him 11 days earlier. 6 weeks if the chemo held. 3 if it didn't. The doctor had used the word cancer twice, slowly, the way you spell a child's name. Salvatore had not nodded. He had not blinked. He had paid in cash, walked out, and sat in the back of a Lincoln Town car for an hour without speaking. The driver knew enough to keep both hands on the wheel. By the time he got back to the social club on 18th Avenue, he had decided 2 things. He would tell no one in the family. And before the end, he would find somewhere to put the weight down. He had not been inside a church in 31 years. Not since his mother's funeral. Not since the morning his uncle Vincenzo had been buried in a closed casket, because there had not been enough of him left for an open one. Salvatore had stood at the back of that funeral in a coat too thin for January. He had not crossed himself. He had not knelt. He had walked out before the final blessing, because a phone call had come in about a missing shipment of cigarettes off the Red Hook Pier. He remembered the cigarettes. He could not remember a single word the priest had said over his uncle's body. Tonight was different. Tonight he had told his driver to take him to Bensonhurst. Not to the social club. Not to the restaurant on 86th. To a small parish on a side street he hadn't walked since he was a teenager. St. Rosalia. The building was older than him by 100 years. The doors were unlocked, the way they used to be when he was a kid and his grandmother dragged him there on Sundays. The vestibule smelled like cold candle wax and old wood. The pews were empty. One small light glowed near the altar. Another glowed behind the lattice of the confessional in the far corner. Someone was in there. Waiting. 2 of his enforcers were outside in a double-parked Lincoln, smoking with the windows cracked. Marco at the wheel. Big Sal in the passenger seat. Big Sal was his nephew on his sister's side, a man who had broken a stranger's jaw at 16 for a comment about his mother and had been useful to the family ever since. Both of them thought their boss was inside for 10 minutes of theater. A penance, a few Hail Marys, a story he could tell himself on the drive home. They didn't know about the doctor. They didn't know about the number 6. They didn't know that the man in the back seat of their Lincoln had decided, somewhere between the East River and the Verrazano, that he was going to confess every body he had ever ordered and every dollar he had ever moved before he died. He had not chosen the church. The church had chosen itself. He had passed it 3 nights in a row on the way back from the doctor's office. 3 nights in a row, the lights had been on at 11 o'clock when nothing else on the block was open. On the 4th night, he had told Marco to pull over. He pushed through the heavy wooden door at the back of the nave. He walked the side aisle with his hands in his coat pockets. He stopped twice. Once at a small statue of the Madonna where he had stood as a boy. Once at a row of votive candles where 3 were still burning. He thought about lighting a 4th. He didn't. He kept walking. The confessional was at the end of the side aisle, set back into the wall, the door on his side slightly open. He stepped inside. He closed the door. He knelt. The wood under his knees was worn smooth by other people's weight. He waited. He listened. The voice on the other side of the lattice cleared its throat softly and said, in plain English, "Take your time, my son." And then in Latin, very gently, the opening words of absolution, half-spoken, like a man humming a song he had known his whole life. Salvator closed his eyes. He started at the beginning. He told the priest about a man named Tony Bevilacqua, a longshoreman on Pier 11 who had been skimming envelopes off a 1986 shipment of stolen electronics. Tony had been 29 years old. Salvator had been 27. The order had not come from Salvator. The order had come from Salvator's father-in-law, a man named Carmen Locasio, who was the boss of the family at the time. Salvator had driven the car. He had not pulled the trigger. He had wiped the trigger after. He had stood for an hour in the cold off the East River and watched a duffel bag full of weight sink in the dark water by the Sunset Park bulkhead. He told the priest the exact pier number. He told him the exact date. He told him the names of the 2 men in the second car who had handled the body. One of them was dead now of a heart attack. The other lived in a condo in Boca Raton. The voice on the other side of the lattice said one quiet line of Latin. Misericordia. Mercy. Nothing else. He told him about an accountant in 1991, a man with thin glasses and a wife who taught 2nd grade in Marine Park, who had been quietly diverting money from a construction skim on a city contract for a new pier in Red Hook. He told him about a New Jersey supplier in 1994 who had threatened to go to the state attorney general about a tainted concrete shipment that had killed 2 ironworkers on a bridge job. He told him about a string of small earners across the late 90s whose envelopes had stopped coming up the chain and who had been quietly retired into the marshes off the Belt Parkway. He spoke their names. He spoke their addresses. He spoke the years. He had never said any of these names out loud, anywhere in his life. Not to his wife. Not to his consigliere. Not to his own reflection. He had carried them inside his coat like stones in a pocket for 40 years, and tonight, for the first time, he was putting them down on a wooden bench in front of a stranger he could not see. He stopped. He listened to the rain on the roof. He smelled the candle wax. He felt the cold of the kneeler through the wool of his pants. The voice on the other side said, very gently, "Go on, my son. Anything you need to say." Salvator wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He went on. He told the priest about the dock contracts. He told him about the names of 3 city inspectors who took an envelope every Friday at a diner on Court Street. He told him about the federal witness the family had hunted since 1998, a man named Daniel Provenzano, who had walked into a Brooklyn field office on a Tuesday in March and walked out 2 hours later with a new last name and a new town somewhere west of the Mississippi. The family had spent 22 years and a great deal of money trying to find Daniel Provenzano. Salvator had personally signed off on 3 contracts on the man's life. None had landed. None had even come close. He paused. He waited. The voice on the other side said nothing for a long moment. Then it said, in plain English this time, "You have carried a great deal, my son." Salvatore nodded once, even though no one could see him. He pressed his forehead to the wood. He felt something break in his chest that was not the cancer. He kissed the lattice. He felt the old olive wood under his lips. He whispered, "Forgive me, Father." Then he stayed there on his knees with his eyes closed, waiting for whatever came next. Outside in the double-parked Lincoln, Marco lit another cigarette and looked at the dashboard clock. 11:19. He thought about how strange it was, the boss in a church this late. He shrugged. He cracked the window another inch. Big Sal was already half asleep with his head against the passenger glass. Marco let him sleep. The night was quiet. The rain had eased. Nothing on the street moved. A small click came from the other side of the lattice. It was so soft Salvatore almost missed it. The kind of click a metal clasp makes when it is pressed once with a thumb. He opened his eyes. Through the carved olive wood, in the dim orange lamp glow, he saw the priest reach up with one slow hand and pull back the white collar at his throat. The hand was steady. The fingers were thick. There was a scar along the jawline above the collar, an old scar, the kind a knife leaves when the cut is shallow and the panic is high. Salvatore had seen that scar before. He had stared at that scar for an hour at a kitchen table in 1998, on a faded police mugshot tacked to a piece of plywood on the wall of a back room above a bakery on 18th Avenue. The plywood had been called the board. The mugshot had been Daniel Provenzano. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. For a moment, Salvatore could not move. His hand stayed on the kneeler. His breath stayed in his chest. He stared through the carved wood at the scarred jaw on the other side. The man behind the lattice did not move either. He sat very still in plain black clericals, with his collar pulled back an inch, the way you fold a napkin slowly when you are not in a hurry. In his other hand, resting on the small shelf below the lattice, was a flat black recorder no bigger than a wallet. A small green light glowed steady on its face. The light had been glowing the whole time. Salvatore had not seen it through the dim of the wood. He saw it now. The man behind the lattice spoke. His voice was the same soft voice that had murmured Latin between confessions. It was not a priest's voice. It had never been a priest's voice. He said, "Hello, Sal. It's been a long time." He said it the way an old neighbor says it across a fence. No anger. No triumph. Just the flat tone of a man who had waited 22 years for the door to open and had finally heard the knock. Salvatore did not answer. His mouth was open. His tongue would not move. The man behind the lattice tilted the recorder so the green light pointed at the wood between them. He said, "Every word you just said is in a building on Cadman Plaza East. They got the file 10 minutes ago. They've been listening live since you said the words Pier 11. He paused. He let the words settle. He said, "I'm sorry it had to be tonight, Sal. I really am. But you came in. I didn't make you come in." Salvatore found his voice. It came out as a whisper. He said one word. He said, "Daniel." The man on the other side closed his eyes for a moment, the way a man closes his eyes when he hears his own name spoken in a place he never thought he'd hear it again. Then he opened them. He said, "Yes, Al. It's me." Salvatore's hands started to shake again on the kneeler. He looked down at them. They were old hands. The knuckles were thick. The wedding ring on the left was scratched to dullness from 40 years of work. He thought about Marco and Big Sal in the Lincoln on the street. He thought about the .38 in the holster under his left arm. He thought about how easy it would be to stand up, push through the curtain on his side, walk around to the priest's side, open that door, and finish what the family had paid 3 contracts to finish. He did not move. He could not move. Something heavier than the gun under his arm was pressing him down onto the kneeler. He understood, the way a man understands a tide, that the moment had already passed. The recorder had already done its work. Whatever he did in the next 60 seconds would not pull the words back. The words were already in a building across the bridge. The words were already in the ears of people he had spent 40 years avoiding. The man behind the lattice spoke again. He said, "I'm going to tell you what's going to happen now, Sal, and I need you to listen, because there isn't much time." He said it the way a doctor tells a patient a diagnosis. Slow, clear, no room for argument. He said, in about 20 minutes, 2 cars are going to pull up at the end of this block. They're not going to use the sirens. They're going to walk in here through the front door. Before that happens, your 2 boys in the Lincoln are going to be approached on the street by a 3rd car coming from the other direction. Nobody is going to get hurt tonight if everybody keeps their hands where people can see them. He paused. He said, by sunrise, there will be indictments out of the Eastern District against you, against your underboss, against your consigliere, against your capos in Bensonhurst, in Bath Beach, in Howard Beach, and in the 2 crews you've been quietly running in Staten Island. RICO. Murder in aid of racketeering. Conspiracy. The whole stack. He paused again. He said, "You gave them the names tonight, Sal. You gave them the dates. You gave them the peers. You gave them everything we needed for 22 years." Salvetter closed his eyes. He thought for one long second about the doctor in Manhattan, about the number 6, about the way his wife Anna had laughed in the kitchen that morning over coffee because the dog had walked sideways across the tile chasing a ladybug. He thought about his daughter Sophia in her apartment in Park Slope, who taught literature at a small college in Lower Manhattan, and who had not spoken to him in 4 years over an argument neither of them had ever been able to put into words. He thought about his son Michael, who was 28 and who was probably, at this exact moment, sitting in the back of a different restaurant in Mill Basin with a different crew, learning the same trade Salvator had learned at the same age, on the same streets, with the same hands. He thought, if I had spoken to Sophia last year, if I had pulled Michael out 2 years ago, if I had walked into this church when I was 35 instead of 58. If. The man behind the lattice said, "Sal, are you with me?" Salvetter opened his eyes. He nodded once. The man behind the lattice said, "Good. Now I'm going to ask you to do one thing for me. Take the gun out from under your coat. Slowly. Set it on the floor. Slide it under the curtain on your side. Then sit back down on the kneeler and put your hands on your knees and wait. Can you do that?" Salvetter reached inside his coat with his right hand. His fingers found the worn grip of the .38 he had carried for 19 years. He had cleaned it on a kitchen table in Brooklyn every Sunday morning since the Clinton administration. He pulled it out. He looked at it once. He set it on the floor of the confessional. He pushed it gently with the side of his shoe until it slid under the curtain and out into the carpeted aisle of the church. He heard nothing on the other side. The man behind the lattice did not move. He had not asked to see the gun. He had only asked to know that Salvetter had set it down. Salvetter sat back. He put his hands on his knees. He waited. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The rain ticked on the stained glass above the altar. A votive candle near the side wall flickered out, and a thin curl of gray smoke rose toward the ceiling. Somewhere in the building, a pipe knocked twice and was still. The man behind the lattice said, "Can I ask you something, Sal?" Salvetter said, "Yeah." The man behind the lattice said, "Why tonight? Why this church? Why me?" Salvatore did not answer right away. He looked at his hands. He looked at the dim orange light bleeding through the carved wood. He said, "The doctor gave me 6 weeks. He said I didn't want to die with all of it still inside. He said I didn't know it was you." The man behind the lattice was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know, Sal. I know." The first car arrived 22 minutes later. It did not use a siren. It stopped at the end of the block with its lights off. 2 men in plain coats walked up the sidewalk and stopped beside the double-parked Lincoln. A third car pulled in from the other direction and stopped in front of the Lincoln, blocking it. Marco saw them coming in the side mirror, and his hand moved once toward the inside of his jacket. The man on the sidewalk lifted one hand, palm flat, and shook his head slowly. Marco looked at him. He looked at Big Sal, who was now awake and staring at the second car. Marco took his hand off his jacket. He put both hands on top of the steering wheel. The man on the sidewalk nodded once. He opened the driver's door. He said, "Both of you slowly out of the car." Marco and Big Sal got out slowly. They were patted down on the side of the Lincoln. Their pieces were removed. They were turned around and walked, without handcuffs, into the back of the third car. Nothing was said. Nothing was broken. A neighbor in a second floor window above a bakery across the street watched the whole thing and assumed it was a friend of the family being given a ride home. Inside the church, Salvatore Marchetti was still sitting in the confessional with his hands on his knees. The man behind the lattice had not spoken in 10 minutes. They could both hear faintly the front door of the church open and close. They could hear 3 sets of footsteps on the stone floor of the nave. The footsteps stopped near the side aisle. A voice, low and calm, said, "Salvatore Marchetti, I'm Special Agent Reyes, Eastern District of New York. We'd like you to step out of the confessional, sir. Please keep your hands where we can see them." Salvatore looked at the carved wood between him and the man on the other side. He said quietly, "Daniel." The man behind the lattice said, "Yes, Sal." Salvatore said, "The gun on the floor. Don't leave it for them to find by accident. Make sure they pick it up first." The man behind the lattice almost smiled. He said, "I'll tell them." He paused. He said, "Take care of yourself, Sal." Salvatore said, "You too." Then he stood up. He pushed open the curtain on his side. He stepped out into the aisle. 3 men in coats were standing at a respectful distance. 2 had their hands near their sides but not raised. The third had a small leather case in one hand. Salvatore put his hands out in front of him, palms up, fingers spread. The man with the leather case said, "Thank you, sir." He stepped forward. He clipped a pair of cuffs gently around Salvatore's wrists. He turned him around. He walked him toward the back door of the church. By 3 in the morning, the federal building on Cadman Plaza East was lit on every floor. By 4, 11 other men had been brought in through 3 different entrances. The underboss had been taken out of a brownstone in Bay Ridge in his bathrobe. The consigliere had been taken out of a back booth at a restaurant on 86th Street, where he had been eating a late plate of veal. 3 capos had been picked up at home in Bath Beach and Bensonhurst. 2 more had been picked up in Howard Beach and on Staten Island. Michael Marchetti, Salvatore's son, had been picked up in the back of a different restaurant in Mill Basin at 12:45 in the morning. Michael had stood up slowly when the agents came in. He had not reached for anything. He had looked once at his coffee cup. He had walked out the front door with 2 agents at his elbow and had not said a word. By 6 in the morning, a grand jury draft sat on a desk in the United States Attorney's Office with 37 counts and 41 named defendants. By 9, the front page of the Daily News had a photograph of Salvatore Marchetti walking through a doorway in a black wool coat, his head down, his hands in front of him, with the headline reading, "Sunday School, Boss Gives Up the Whole Book." Anna Marchetti read the headline at her kitchen table at 9:20. She had been making coffee when her phone rang. She had not answered. She had walked to the front step in her robe and picked up the newspaper. She had stood in the doorway for a long time looking at the picture. Then she had walked back inside. She had not cried. She had sat at the kitchen table with the coffee cooling in the cup and the dog sleeping at her feet, and she had read the article all the way through, slowly, twice. When she finished, she folded the paper. She set it on the counter. She walked into the bedroom and opened the closet and looked at her husband's 2 coats hanging there. Then she closed the closet door. She went back to the kitchen. She picked up the phone. She called Sophia in Park Slope. She said, "Your father is in the news. You should see it before someone else tells you." Sophia did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Mom, are you okay?" Anna said, "I'm okay. Come over when you can." In a small interview room on the 8th floor of the federal building, Salvatore Marchetti sat in a metal chair across from 2 agents and a lawyer who had not been his lawyer the day before. The lawyer was good. The lawyer was the kind of lawyer who would have charged Salvatore $600 an hour 2 days ago, and who was now sitting beside him for nothing because the lawyer had been appointed by the court at 4 in the morning. The agents were patient. The agents asked their questions slowly. They had the recording. They had the transcripts. They had everything they needed. They were not in a hurry. Salvatore answered when his lawyer told him to answer. He stayed quiet when his lawyer told him to stay quiet. Once in the middle of the morning, he asked for a glass of water. An agent brought him one in a paper cup. He drank it slowly. He thought about the doctor in Manhattan. He thought about the number 6. He did not say any of that out loud. He set the cup down on the table. He looked at the agent across from him. He said, "Can I ask you something?" The agent said, "Sure." Salvatore said, "The priest. Last night. Is he all right?" The agent looked at him for a long moment. The agent said, "Yeah. He's all right. He's on his way home." Salvatore nodded once. He said, "Good." Then he sat back in the chair and waited for the next question. The cancer did what the doctor in Manhattan had said it would do. 6 weeks turned into 9. 9 turned into 14. The federal lockup moved him to a medical wing in late summer. Anna visited every Wednesday and every Sunday. Sophia visited twice in the first month, and then every Sunday after that. Michael was being held in a different facility on different counts and could not come. Daniel Provenzano did not come, but Daniel Provenzano sent, through a chain of 3 intermediaries, a single line on an unsigned card that simply read, "I'm sorry it had to be that night." Salvatore kept the card in the drawer of the small metal table next to his bed. He did not show it to anyone. He read it once a week. On a quiet Tuesday in October, he died in his sleep. The nurse who found him said his hands were folded on his chest and his face was calm. The funeral was small. 12 people came. Anna stood at the front in a black coat. Sophia stood beside her. A small priest with a soft voice, a real one this time, from a church Salvatore had never been to in his life, said the words over him. The grave was on a hillside in a cemetery in Queens. The headstone was plain. It said his name. It said the years of his birth and death. It said nothing else. The family that had been his for 40 years was, by the time of the funeral, in pieces. 38 of the 41 named in the indictment had taken pleas. The 2 who had not were waiting for trial. The streets in Bensonhurst and Bath Beach and Howard Beach that had once moved on his word moved now on no one's word, and the men who would have moved them were in rooms with metal doors and small windows. Anna Marchetti went on living. Sophia took a year off from teaching and came to stay with her. The dog walked sideways across the kitchen tile, chasing ladybugs again in the spring. And in a small church on a side street in Bensonhurst, on a quiet night in November, Daniel Provenzano sat alone in a back pew for an hour with his collar turned up and his hands folded in his lap. And he said, very quietly, in plain English this time, a single line for the man who had knelt on the other side of the lattice on the last night of his life. Then he stood up. He buttoned his coat. He walked out the front door. He did not come back.